On the 2nd of June 1978, a Boeing 747 approached Japan's Itami airport for a landing on runway 32 left. On touchdown, the aircraft bounced, then came down at a sharp angle, striking its tail on the ground. Several passengers were injured by the rough landing, but all recovered. The plane was taken briefly out of service for inspection and repair. By the time it returned to service, the accident was largely forgotten, and would remain so for 7 long years before its legacy would emerge again in the very worst possible way. Japan Airlines is Japan's preferred national airline and the 6th largest airline in the world. Its origins can be traced back to the 1950s, when the company was first incorporated as the country's government-operated airline. Since then, Japan Airlines has taken on numerous services, both commuter and cargo. Japan Airlines not only serves overseas routes but also handles the majority of the country's domestic flights. The airline has a varied fleet, but the most recognizable of their aircraft in the 1970s and 1980s was the Boeing 747. These iconic planes featured high-density seating and could hold over 500 passengers. These high-capacity flights were very profitable for the company, and it was not uncommon for the airline to use large aircraft like the 747 even for relatively short flights. On the evening of the 12th of August 1985 at 6:12 p.m., a Boeing 747 with the registration JA8119 took to the skies. This was Japan Airlines Flight 123, flying from Tokyo Haneda Airport to Osaka International. The flight was loaded to near capacity. This was, in part, due to the Japanese annual holiday period of Obon, during which many Japanese citizens visit their hometowns. On board were a total of 15 staff and 509 passengers. The cockpit crew was made up of Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda. All were very experienced and familiar with the route. The flight, for all of them, should have been completely routine. At 6:24 p.m., however, just as the plane reached 24,400 feet, or 7,300 meters, a loud bang reverberated throughout the plane, and the cabin filled with a thick fog, something the cabin crew immediately recognized as a sign of sudden decompression. The fog was the result of the pressurized cabin air instantly turning into water vapor due to a change in pressure. Passenger oxygen masks were deployed. In the cockpit, alarms started blaring. Captain Takahama was heard on the cockpit voice recorder saying, "Not good. Something's exploded." After issuing a distress call, the crew made a right-hand bank in an attempt to return to Haneda Airport. As the plane turned, however, it did so at a much steeper angle than expected. Captain Takahama ordered First Officer Yutaka not to bank so sharply, unaware that his colleague was already trying to correct the issue. Yutaka was struggling to control the aircraft, and it soon became evident why. Flight Engineer Fukuda announced that the hydraulic pressure was dropping, and that hydraulic lines somewhere in the aircraft must have been severed. This was a dire revelation, as the hydraulic system was responsible for controlling functions such as the rudder, the flaps, and the ailerons. The crew wanted to descend to below 10,000 feet, where breathable air could be found, but simply could not control the plane well enough to make this happen. Worse still, the lack of oxygen was causing hypoxia in the crew. Hypoxia is a condition caused by insufficient oxygen in the brain, the symptoms of which include confusion, anxiety, and a lack of clarity or focus. As hypoxia set in, the crew's responses became much slower and much less consistent. The plane began a rapidly worsening cycle of out-of-control ascent, followed by out-of-control descent, known as a phugoid cycle. As the nose pitched up, the airspeed decreased, which caused it to then pitch down. This would result in an increase in airspeed, forcing the aircraft into another climb. In addition to this, with the vertical stabilizer gone, the aircraft also exhibited severe Dutch rolls to the right and left. Witnesses on the ground who saw the plane described it as flying like a drunken bird. In the cabin, flight attendants tried to maintain calm and help passengers with oxygen masks. Many passengers, knowing something had gone seriously wrong, began writing out notes to loved ones on whatever they could find. Air traffic control were now continuously trying to contact the aircraft, with varying responses from the hypoxic crew. For the next half an hour, the plane remained in the air, losing altitude, with the crew desperately trying to regain control. They adjusted the thrust on each engine, varied the position of the flaps, and tried lowering the landing gear to increase drag. Nothing worked. At 6:55 p.m., in the confusion, the right flaps were mistakenly lowered, then forgotten about. The crew also raised power to the number 1 and 2 engines, causing a steep bank of as much as 82 degrees to the right. The plane stalled and began a dive towards Mount Takamagahara below. The ground proximity warning system began to sound. The crew scrambled to try and bring the plane back up and avoid a crash, but the cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Takahama's final assessment of the situation. It's the end. At 6:56 p.m., the right wing brushed against the trees on a mountain ridge, made contact with the ridge, and sheared off completely. The remaining fuselage hurtled upside down into the mountain, exploding on impact. Immediately, a rescue operation was launched. A US Air Force C-130 spotted and reported the location of the crash site. A helicopter and other resources at the US Yokota Air Base were put on standby, but were either recalled or never dispatched, as the Japanese government wished to handle the rescue operation themselves. A Japanese self-defense force helicopter later overflew the wreck. By this time, night had fallen and large amounts of smoke reduced visibility so severely that a landing was not possible. The helicopter crew reported that they could see no survivors. A ground recovery team was sent out and reached the remote wreck site the next morning. They expected no survivors, and yet one survivor was very quickly found. In the following hours, 3 more would be located, for a total of 4 survivors and 520 deceased. As body after body was recovered, it became apparent that as many as 40 people had survived the initial impact, but succumbed to their injuries while awaiting rescue. Off-duty purser Yumi Ochiai, who was one of the few survivors, described the night she spent on the mountainside. After the crash, I heard harsh panting and gasping noises from many people. I heard it coming from everywhere, all around me. There was a boy crying, "Mother." I clearly heard a young woman saying, "Come quickly." Suddenly, I heard a boy's voice. "Okay, I'll hang on," he said. It sounded like the voice of a boy of about school age. In the darkness, I could hear the sound of a helicopter. I couldn't see any light, but I could hear the sound, and it was quite near, too. We will be saved, I thought, and waved frantically. But the helicopter went farther away. "Don't go," I waved desperately. "Help!" But it faded. I could no longer hear the voices of the boy or the young woman. Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission was tasked with finding out how such a tragedy could have occurred. Looking into the plane's maintenance records, they learned that the plane had experienced a tail strike during a rough landing in 1978. It had been sent to Boeing for repairs, where mechanics and engineers had installed a metal plate to reinforce a damaged bulkhead. It was discovered that this repair had been done improperly. Instead of using one continuous plate to make the repair, 2 separate plates were used, creating an uneven stress load on the larger plate. During thousands of repeated cycles of takeoff and landing, the plate had weakened, until finally, on the 12th of August 1985, it broke apart. The failure of the plate had sliced the plane's hydraulic lines, which had caused the loss of control that doomed the aircraft. This finding resulted in a great deal of public outrage. Boeing was seen as the most directly responsible, but the public believed that Japan Airlines was also to blame. For a time, many refused to travel on Japan Airlines planes. Japan Airlines also paid family members of the deceased around 780 million yen, or $7.6 million compensation, and the president of the company resigned. The crash of Flight 123 inspired flight instructor Denny Fitch in the United States to experiment with simulated hydraulics failures. This experience would later prove invaluable when United Airlines Flight 232 lost its hydraulics mid-flight. Denny Fitch, who happened to be on board as a passenger, was able to assist the crew in making a partially successful crash landing, saving the lives of many of those on board. In 2006, the Safety Promotion Center at Haneda Airport was opened. It featured artifacts from the plane and the passengers who had perished, with the goal of teaching future crew and passengers about the importance of airline safety. A memorial was installed at the crash site in 2009, along with stairs to allow better access for the families of the deceased. Every year, on the 12th of August, they gather to remember their fallen family and friends, celebrate their legacies, and remember the lives that were brought to an end by a sudden, devastating accident.